Explaining the Cuban Revolution. In 1952, former Cuban President Batista staged a military coup after it became clear that he would not win the next election. He would then plunge Cuba into a military dictatorship and would establish relations with the United States. Under his rule, large plots of land were bought by the U.S., and Cuba became a haven for crime syndicates. All of this would end up angering a young lawyer named Fidel Castro. In 1953, him, along with a large group of people, attacked an isolated barracks in Moncada in an attempt to gain more weapons. This did not work, however, and Fidel was captured. During Fidel's trial, he would make the famous 2-hour speech, La historia me absolverá, otherwise known as History Will Absolve Me. This would help sway public opinion in Castro's favor. Fidel would end up being sentenced to 15 years in prison, though, due to international pressure for reforms, Batista would end up releasing the political prisoners just 2 years after they were imprisoned. Fidel and his brother Raul would then flee to Mexico in an attempt to regroup. They would then meet with other Cuban exiles and would meet an Argentinian doctor known as Ernesto Che Guevara. Back in Cuba, more anti-Batista protests happened after rising unemployment rates and a controversial election. These riots would lead to Batista becoming even more oppressive to the Cuban people. Back with the revolutionaries in Mexico, they would buy a yacht named Grandma, and 82 men would sail back to Cuba. The government, however, knew that they were returning to Cuba and attacked them when they landed. Only a handful survived, and they fled to the mountains. From their mountain base, they would launch guerrilla attacks on military targets and would gain new members. Foreign journalists were allowed to visit, and along with their pirate radio station, this would give them international attention. This would increase their popularity. In the cities, 2 new rebel groups showed up and launched attacks against Batista. Angry and desperate, Batista would send a large army group into the mountains to try and find Fidel's group and kill them. This would fail, however, as the guerrilla fighters would end up winning, and many of the army's troops would end up switching sides to the rebels. Now, with more members and the support of the Cuban public, they would launch a counterattack. Che Guevara would take control of one arm of the army and head to Santa Clara. Yacos would take another and march into Yaguay, and Fidel would follow with reinforcements. As they marched into villages and towns, they were welcomed, demonstrating to the world that Batista's regime was nearing its end. The international community would urge Batista to leave Cuba, and so he would, allowing the rebels to march straight into Havana. Without much opposition, Raul and Fidel would take power inside of Cuba. They would consolidate their power by wiping any trace of Batista. They would also arrest and kill many of his old supporters. This, along with other repressive laws that were introduced, led many Cubans to flee to the U.S. They would nationalize the land that was owned by large U.S. companies. They would also shut down mobs' casinos. They would also improve healthcare, housing, and schools, all of these being socialist policies. These socialist policies would anger the Americans just above Cuba, who would then place economic sanctions on Cuba. The United States would train Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and oust Fidel from power, but the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion would go on to fail. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro would establish Cuba as a socialist republic and would seek an alliance with the USSR. In conclusion, the Cuban Revolution was an attempt at ousting a Cuban dictator and replacing it with another one that would rule until 2008. Thank you for watching this video on the Cuban Revolution.